The morning sun barely touched the peaks of the Rocky Mountains when Jack Wilson stepped out of his log cabin. At 45 years old, his face showed the wear of someone who had lived through more than his share of hardship. Deep lines ran from the corners of his eyes, carved there by years of squinting against mountain wind and snow. His thick beard, once dark brown, now carried streaks of gray that caught the early light. Jack had been living alone on this mountain for 8 long years. 8 years since the mining accident that changed everything. 8 years since his younger brother died in that terrible cave-in down at the copper mine. The memory still hit him like a punch to the gut every time he thought about it. The cabin sat on a small clearing halfway up the mountain, surrounded by tall pine trees that swayed and whispered in the wind. It was a simple place, just 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, and a small porch that faced the valley below. Jack had built most of it himself, using logs from the very trees that surrounded him. Every nail, every board told a story of his determination to survive away from the world that had taken his brother. Living up here meant being completely cut off from civilization for months at a time. The nearest town, Cedar Falls, was 30 miles down a winding dirt road that became impossible to travel once the snow started falling. During winter, Jack might not see another human being for 4 or 5 months straight. Most people would go crazy from that kind of isolation. But Jack had convinced himself he preferred it this way. His daily routine was as predictable as the sunrise. Wake up before dawn, check the small vegetable garden he had managed to coax from the rocky soil, tend to his 2 goats and handful of chickens, chop wood for the fire, and hunt or fish for his dinner. In the evenings, he would sit on his porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sun disappear behind the mountain peaks. But there was one part of his routine that Jack absolutely dreaded: cooking. The man who could build a cabin with his bare hands, who could track a deer through fresh snow, who could fix any broken tool or engine, was completely hopeless in the kitchen. His meals consisted mainly of beans straight from the can, burnt attempts at bread that came out harder than rocks, and whatever meat he could manage to cook without turning it into charcoal. Jack's cooking disasters had become legendary, at least in his own mind. There was the time he tried to make soup and somehow managed to burn water. The incident with the pancakes that turned into something resembling tree bark. The great potato explosion of last winter, when he left them boiling too long and came back to find his kitchen covered in potato paste. His stomach growled as he thought about breakfast. Opening his small pantry, Jack stared at the same depressing options he faced every morning. Canned beans, stale crackers, some questionable jerky he had made months ago, and a loaf of bread that could probably be used as a weapon. He grabbed the beans and dumped them into a pot, not even bothering to heat them up anymore. As he ate his cold breakfast, Jack looked around his cabin and felt the familiar weight of loneliness settle on his shoulders. The place was functional but hardly comfortable. Dust covered most surfaces. His clothes were piled in corners instead of being properly stored, and there was a persistent smell of burnt food that seemed to have soaked into the wooden walls. Sometimes, late at night when the wind howled through the trees, Jack wondered if he was slowly going crazy up here. He talked to his animals more than any person should. He had entire conversations with his reflection in the small mirror above his wash basin. Last week, he had spent an hour arguing with a squirrel about who owned the nuts that fell near his cabin. The isolation was taking its toll on his health, too. His clothes hung loose on his frame from years of poor nutrition. His hands, once steady enough to thread a needle in the dark, now shook slightly when he tried to do delicate work. Dark circles under his eyes spoke of too many sleepless nights when the silence became too loud to bear. Jack's nearest neighbor was Pete Morrison, an old-timer who lived about 5 miles down the mountain. Pete was in his 70s and had been living in these mountains since before Jack was born. He knew every trail, every stream, every hiding spot where deer liked to graze. More importantly, Pete was the only human contact Jack had for most of the year. Every few weeks during the warmer months, Pete would make the trek up to Jack's cabin. These visits were the highlight of Jack's existence, though he would never admit it out loud. Pete would bring news from town, share a meal, and sometimes stay the night if the weather looked threatening. During one of these visits last month, Pete had sat on Jack's porch, shaking his head as he watched Jack attempt to cook dinner. The meat was burned on the outside and raw on the inside. The vegetables had been boiled into mush, even the coffee tasted like mud. "Boy, you're gonna kill yourself eating like this," Pete had said, pushing his plate away after a few brave bites. "You need someone who knows their way around a kitchen." Jack had laughed it off at the time, but Pete's words stuck with him. As autumn approached and he faced another long winter of terrible meals and increasing isolation, the idea began to seem less ridiculous. The truth was, Jack was getting scared. Not of bears or mountain lions or blizzards. He could handle all of those. He was scared of what he was becoming. The man who used to laugh easily, who had friends in town, who could carry on a conversation about anything, was disappearing. In his place was someone who grunted instead of speaking, who forgot basic social skills, who sometimes went days without saying a single word out loud. His brother Danny would have been horrified to see what Jack had become. Danny had always been the social one, the one who could make friends anywhere, who believed that people needed other people to truly live. Before the accident, Jack had been planning to move to the city, maybe find work as a carpenter or mechanic. He had dreams of starting a family, of building something bigger than just surviving day to day. But when Danny died, those dreams died with him. Jack had fled to the mountains not just to escape his grief, but to punish himself for being the one who survived. The isolation was his penance, the terrible meals his daily reminder that he didn't deserve comfort or happiness. Now, 8 years later, Jack was starting to realize that his self-imposed exile might be killing him just as surely as any mine accident. His body was slowly breaking down from poor nutrition and lack of proper care. His mind was beginning to fray from too much solitude. Even his basic survival skills were suffering because he was too tired and malnourished to perform them properly. One morning in early September, as Jack stood on his porch watching the first leaves begin to change color, he made a decision that surprised even himself. Maybe it was time to try something different. Maybe Pete had been right about needing help. Maybe 8 years of punishment was enough. The idea of having another person in his space terrified him almost as much as it appealed to him. He had grown so used to his solitude that the thought of sharing his cabin, his routine, his carefully controlled world, felt overwhelming. What if they asked too many questions about his past? What if they wanted to talk when he preferred silence? What if they tried to change things? But then his stomach rumbled, reminding him of the can of cold beans waiting for him inside, and Jack realized that maybe change wouldn't be such a bad thing after all. He needed someone who could cook, someone who could help him maintain his home properly, someone who might help him remember how to be human again. The more he thought about it, the more the idea made sense. Winter was coming, and it would be his hardest yet. His body wasn't as strong as it used to be, and the thought of spending another 5 months completely alone filled him with dread. Having help around the cabin would be practical. Having company would be, well, he wasn't ready to admit how much he needed that. Jack spent the next few days working up the courage to act on his decision. He practiced what he would say, how. He would explain his situation without revealing too much about why he lived alone. He counted his savings to make sure he could afford to pay someone fairly. He even attempted to clean his cabin, though his efforts only highlighted how badly he needed professional help. Finally, on a crisp morning when the mountain air felt full of possibilities, Jack hitched up his old truck and began the long drive down to Cedar Falls. It was time to find someone who could help him survive not just the coming winter, but maybe even learn to live again. The drive down to Cedar Falls took Jack nearly 2 hours on the winding mountain road. His old pickup truck groaned and complained with every turn, its engine struggling with the steep descent. Jack hadn't made this trip in over 3 months, and he felt his anxiety growing with every mile that brought him closer to civilization. Cedar Falls wasn't much of a town by most standards. The main street consisted of a general store, a small diner, a gas station, and a handful of other businesses that served the scattered population of mountain folk and farmers in the area. The whole place had maybe 300 residents on a good day, but to Jack it felt as crowded and overwhelming as a major city. He parked his truck outside Miller's General Store and sat for a moment, gathering his courage. Through the dusty windshield, He could see people going about their daily business. Mrs. Chen watering the flowers outside her small restaurant. Old Tom Fletcher arguing with someone about the price of feed. A group of teenagers sitting on the steps of the post office laughing about something. All of it seemed foreign to Jack now. The easy way people talk to each other, the casual greetings, the simple act of being around other humans. It all felt like watching actors in a play he no longer understood. Taking a deep breath, Jack climbed out of his truck and walked toward the general store. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, and several heads turned to look at him. He could feel their curious stares taking in his overgrown beard, his worn clothes, his obvious discomfort at being around people. "Well, I'll be," said Bob Miller from behind the counter. "Jack Wilson, as I live and breathe. Haven't seen you down here since spring." Bob was a friendly man in his 60s who had run the general store for as long as anyone could remember. He had a reputation for knowing everyone's business and being willing to help with just about any problem that came his way. Bob, Jack, nodded, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Need to put up a notice on your board." Bob's eyebrows rose with interest. In a small town like Cedar Falls, any news was big news, and Jack Wilson, putting up a notice was definitely something worth talking about. "Sure thing," Bob said, gesturing toward the community bulletin board near the front of the store. "What kind of notice?" Jack had practiced this moment, but now that he was actually here, the words felt clumsy in his mouth. "Looking for someone to help around my place. Cooking, cleaning, that sort of thing. Through the winter." The store went quiet. Even the teenagers outside seemed to sense that something interesting was happening and pressed their faces against the window to listen. "You mean like a housekeeper?" asked Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who was examining canned goods nearby. "Up on your mountain?" "Something like that," Jack mumbled, feeling his face flush. "Room and board, fair wages. Just need someone who can cook proper meals and keep things tidy." Bob scratched his chin thoughtfully. "That's quite a change for you, Jack. You sure about this?" Jack nodded, though he wasn't sure about anything anymore. "Winter's coming, could use the help." Bob handed him a piece of paper and a pencil. "Write down what you're offering. I'll make sure folks see it." Jack's handwriting was shaky from nerves, but he managed to scrawl out a basic description of what he needed. Someone reliable to help with household duties through the winter months. Room, board, and competitive wages provided. Must be comfortable with isolated mountain living. As he pinned the notice to the board, Jack could hear whispers starting behind him. The mountain hermit was looking for company. This would be the talk of the town for weeks. Might want to stick around for a day or two, Bob suggested kindly. "Give folks a chance to see your notice and think about it." Jack hadn't planned on staying in town, but Bob's suggestion made sense. He booked a room at the small inn above the diner and spent an uncomfortable night listening to the unfamiliar sounds of civilization. Cars passing by, people talking on the street below, the general hum of activity that never completely stopped. The next morning, Jack was having breakfast at the diner when Bob Miller approached his table with an excited expression. "Got someone interested in your job," Bob announced, sliding into the seat across from Jack. "Lady named Rebecca came by first thing this morning asking about your notice." Jack's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. "Rebecca?" "Rebecca Morrison. Lost her husband about 6 months ago. Been having a tough time making ends meet ever since." Bob leaned forward conspiratorially. "She's a real good cook, from what I hear. Used to run the kitchen at the church suppers before her husband got sick." The name Morrison rang a bell and Jack tried to place it. "Any relation to Pete Morrison?" "His daughter-in-law. Well, widow of his son Michael. Pete speaks highly of her, says she's hardworking and honest." Bob paused. "She's been looking for work, and frankly your offer might be just what she needs." Jack felt a mixture of relief and terror. Someone was actually interested in his job offer, which solved one problem. But now he had to actually go through with it, which created a dozen new problems. "She wants to meet with you," Bob continued. "Today, if you're willing. Said she could be here around 2 o'clock. Jack glanced at the clock on the diner wall. It was barely 9 in the morning, which gave him 5 hours to work himself into a complete panic about the whole situation. "Tell her I'll be here," he managed to say. The hours crawled by. Jack tried to occupy himself by walking around town, but everywhere he went, people stared and whispered. Word of his job offer had spread quickly, and everyone seemed to have an opinion about it. Some folks thought it was about time he got some help. Others wondered what a woman would want with living up on that lonely mountain. By the time 2 o'clock arrived, Jack had changed his mind about the whole thing at least a dozen times. He was sitting in a corner booth at the diner, nursing his 3rd cup of coffee and seriously considering making a run for his truck, when the bell above the door chimed. The woman who entered was not what Jack had expected. She was probably in her early 40s with brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and wearing a clean but obviously well-worn dress. What struck Jack most was her posture, straight and dignified despite the tired lines around her eyes that spoke of recent hardship. She looked around the diner until her gaze found Jack, and he knew without being introduced that this was Rebecca. "Morrison?" She walked over to his table with quick, efficient steps. "Mr. Wilson?" she asked, her voice soft but clear. "I'm Rebecca Morrison. Bob Miller said you were looking for household help." Jack stood up awkwardly, nearly knocking over his coffee cup in the process. "Yes, ma'am, please sit down." She slid into the seat across from him and got straight to business. "Bob told me you live up on the mountain and need someone to cook and clean through the winter. Is that correct?" "Yes, ma'am," Jack repeated, feeling like a tongue-tied teenager. "It's pretty isolated up there, no neighbors for miles. Road gets snowed in from November through March usually." Rebecca nodded as if she had expected this. "I'm not afraid of hard work or isolation, Mr. Wilson. What I need to know is whether this is a legitimate offer or if you're looking for something inappropriate." Her directness caught Jack off guard, but he respected it. "It's legitimate. I need someone who can cook proper meals and help keep the place clean. That's all. You'd have your own room, your privacy. I'm not looking for anything beyond household help." "What are you offering for wages?" Jack named a figure that was probably more than fair for the area. Rebecca's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't comment on the amount. "Why now?" she asked. "Bob says you've been living alone up there for years. What changed?" Jack had dreaded this question. How could he explain 8 years of self-imposed exile without sounding completely crazy? How could he tell her about the guilt and grief that had driven him to the mountains, or the growing fear that he was slowly losing his mind? "I'm getting older," he said finally, which was true enough. "Taking care of everything myself is getting harder. Winter's always tough, but this year, I think I need help." Rebecca studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to read the truth in his expression. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her. "I have some conditions," she said. "I want to be able to leave if the arrangement doesn't work out, weather permitting. I'll need advance notice if you want me to cook for guests or handle extra duties, and I want your word that you'll respect my privacy and treat me with dignity." "Of course," Jack said quickly. "All of that sounds reasonable. When would you need me to start?" Jack hadn't really thought about timing. Part of him had expected this whole thing to fall through before it got this far. Soon as possible, I guess. Before the first snow, anyway. Rebecca was quiet for a moment, weighing her options. Jack could practically see her mental calculations. Her current situation versus the uncertainty of living alone with a stranger on an isolated mountain. "I'll do it," she said finally. "I can be ready to move up there by next week." Jack felt a rush of relief mixed with panic. It was really happening. After 8 years of complete solitude, he was going to have a housemate. They spent the next hour working out the practical details. Rebecca would bring her personal belongings and basic necessities. Jack would provide. The following Tuesday arrived gray and chilly, with the first hints of winter in the air. Jack had spent the week since their meeting alternating between excitement and absolute terror about Rebecca's arrival. He had attempted to clean his cabin, which mostly involved moving piles of clutter from one room to another and discovering just how badly he had been living. His attempts at preparing a space for Rebecca had been almost comical. The spare room, which had served as storage for 8 years, was packed floor to ceiling with hunting equipment, broken furniture, old clothes, and boxes of things he couldn't even remember collecting. It took him 3 days just to clear a path to the window. Jack was sitting on his porch, nervously checking his watch for the 10th time in an hour, when he heard the sound of a vehicle struggling up the mountain road. His old pickup truck came into view, and he could see Rebecca in the passenger seat next to Pete Morrison, who had volunteered to bring her up the mountain. The truck pulled to a stop in front of the cabin, and Pete climbed out with a grin. "Special. Delivery," he called out cheerfully. "One housekeeper, as ordered." Rebecca stepped down from the truck with the same quiet dignity Jack remembered from their meeting. She wore a simple traveling dress and carried a small suitcase, looking around at her new surroundings with interest rather than apprehension. "Welcome to your new home," Jack said awkwardly, gesturing toward the cabin. "It's not much, but it's solid." "It's lovely," Rebecca replied, and Jack was surprised to realize she seemed to mean it. "I can see why you chose this spot." Pete helped unload Rebecca's belongings, which consisted of 2 suitcases, a wooden crate filled with kitchen supplies, and a small trunk that looked like it had seen better days. As they carried everything inside, Jack felt embarrassed by the condition of his home. Despite his cleaning efforts, the place still looked rough and unwelcoming, but Rebecca didn't seem bothered by the cabin's shortcomings. She walked through the rooms with a practical eye, already mentally organizing and planning improvements. "The kitchen has good light," she observed, examining the space where Jack had prepared so many terrible meals. "And this wood stove should work well once I get familiar with it." Jack showed her to the spare room, which he had managed to clear and equip with a basic bed, dresser, and washstand. "I know it's not fancy," he began, but Rebecca cut him off. "It's perfect," she said simply. "Thank you for preparing it so nicely." Pete stayed for dinner that first night, which turned out to be a blessing. His easy conversation helped bridge the awkwardness between Jack and Rebecca as they tried to figure out how to exist in the same space. Pete regaled them with stories from town, updates on neighbors Jack hadn't seen in months, and gentle teasing about Jack's legendary cooking disasters. "You should have seen the time he tried to make pancakes," Pete told Rebecca with a chuckle. "Came out looking like hockey pucks. Even the squirrels wouldn't eat them." "That's not true," Jack protested. "The squirrels ate them eventually. Only after they'd been sitting outside for 3 weeks and turned into crumbs," Pete shot back. Rebecca smiled at their banter, and Jack noticed that her whole face changed when she smiled. The worried lines around her eyes softened, and for a moment she looked years younger. After Pete left the next morning, Jack and Rebecca found themselves alone together for the first time. The silence felt heavy and uncomfortable as they tried to establish their new routine. "I usually get up before dawn," Jack said, standing awkwardly in the kitchen doorway. "Don't want to wake you, though." "I'm an early riser myself," Rebecca replied. "Would you like coffee when you get up? I could have it ready." The idea of waking up to fresh coffee instead of the bitter, burnt brew he usually made for himself sounded like heaven. "That would be nice," Jack admitted. "What about meals? When do you usually eat?" Jack realized he didn't really have a usual meal schedule. He ate when he was hungry, which wasn't often given how terrible his food tasted. "Whatever works for you," he said. "I'm not particular about timing." Rebecca nodded and got to work organizing the kitchen. Jack escaped to his workshop behind the cabin, where he could hear her moving around, opening cabinets, rearranging things. The sounds of another person in his space felt both comforting and overwhelming. That first week was an adjustment for both of them. Jack had forgotten how to share space with another person, and he found himself tiptoeing around his own cabin, afraid of disturbing Rebecca or getting in her way. Rebecca, meanwhile, worked quietly and efficiently, transforming the cabin bit by bit without making a big show of the changes. The first real sign of how much things were changing came on the 3rd morning, when Jack woke up to the smell of bacon cooking. Real bacon, not the charred strips he usually produced, but perfectly crispy bacon that filled the cabin with the most wonderful aroma he had experienced in years. He followed his nose to the kitchen, where Rebecca was standing at the stove, expertly managing bacon in one pan and eggs in another. Fresh biscuits were warming in the oven, and coffee, real, properly made coffee, was steaming in a pot on the back burner. "Good morning," Rebecca said without turning around. "I hope you don't mind, but I took the liberty of making a proper breakfast." Jack stared at the scene in amazement. His kitchen, which had always felt like a place of defeat and frustration, had been transformed into something warm and welcoming. Rebecca had somehow made sense of his disorganized supplies and turned them into what looked like a feast. "I don't mind at all," he managed to say. "It smells incredible." When Rebecca set the plate in front of him, Jack almost couldn't believe his eyes. The eggs were perfectly cooked, with golden yolks that weren't too runny or too hard. The bacon was crispy but not burnt. The biscuits were light and fluffy, nothing like the rocks he produced when he tried to bake. The first bite was a revelation. Jack had forgotten that food could actually taste good, that meals could be something to look forward to instead of endure. He found himself eating slowly, savoring every bite. "This is amazing," he said around a mouthful of biscuit. "I'd forgotten food could taste like this." Rebecca looked pleased by his reaction. "My grandmother taught me to cook when I was young. She always said that a good meal was one of life's simple pleasures, and everyone deserved to enjoy it." As the days passed, Jack began to realize just how much his life was changing. Rebecca had a gift for making everything better without making him feel bad about how things had been before. She cleaned his cabin thoroughly but didn't comment on the years of accumulated grime. She organized his belongings but didn't throw anything away without asking. She created systems that made daily life easier, but never made him feel criticized for not having thought of them himself. The meals alone were worth whatever he was paying her. Rebecca could take the simplest ingredients and turn them into something special. She made soup that actually tasted like food instead of dishwater. Her bread was soft and warm, perfect for soaking up gravy or eating with jam. Even leftovers became delicious when Rebecca got her hands on them. But it wasn't just the practical improvements that were changing Jack's life. Having another person around was slowly waking up parts of him that had been sleeping for 8 years. He found himself looking forward to mealtimes not just because the food was good, but because Rebecca was easy company. She had a way of making conversation without being pushy, sharing stories without demanding that he share his own. Rebecca told him about her late husband, Michael, who had been a carpenter like Jack. She spoke about the books she liked to read, the garden she hoped to plant next spring, the small town she had lived in before settling in Cedar Falls. Her stories painted a picture of a woman who had experienced both joy and sorrow, who understood what it meant to lose someone important. Jack found himself talking more than he had in years. He told Rebecca about the mountain, pointing out landmarks and explaining the best places to hunt or fish. He shared stories about building the cabin, about the wildlife that visited his clearing, about the changing seasons on the mountain. These felt like safe topics, far removed from the painful memories he wasn't ready to share. As October progressed, and the first snows began to dust the mountain peaks, Jack realized that his cabin was becoming something it had never been before, a real home. Rebecca had added small touches that made all the difference. Curtains in the windows, cushions on the chairs, a tablecloth that made their simple meals feel special. She had even found some wildflowers and arranged them in a mason jar, bringing color and life to rooms that had been gray and lifeless for so long. The most remarkable change was in Jack himself. He was sleeping better, eating properly for the first time in years, and rediscovering interests he had abandoned. Rebecca had found his old books packed away in boxes and encouraged him to start reading again. She had noticed his wood carvings, gathering dust on shelves, and asked about them, leading him to pick up his tools for the first time in months. "You're very talented," Rebecca said one evening, examining a carved bird he had made years earlier. "This is beautiful work." "Just something to pass the time," Jack said, but he felt pleased by her praise. "My husband was a carpenter too," Rebecca said softly. "He would have appreciated the skill that went into this." December arrived with a vengeance, bringing the heaviest snowfall Jack had seen in years. The mountain was transformed into a white wonderland, beautiful but completely isolating. The road down to Cedar Falls disappeared under 3 feet of snow, effectively cutting them off from the outside world until spring. For the first time in 8 years, Jack wasn't bothered by this isolation. If anything, he found himself grateful for the excuse to stay close to home. Rebecca had settled into the rhythm of mountain life as if she had been born to it. She seemed to genuinely enjoy the quiet pace, the simple routine, the way each day unfolded without the rush and noise of town life. In the mornings, she would stand at the kitchen window with her coffee, watching the sun rise over the snow-covered peaks with an expression of peaceful contentment. Their evening routine had become something Jack looked forward to all day. After dinner and the evening chores were done, they would sit by the fireplace. Rebecca would work on her mending or knitting while Jack carved wood or maintained his tools. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they simply enjoyed the comfortable silence, but always there was a sense of companionship that filled the cabin with warmth. It was on one such evening in late December that everything changed forever. Jack had been working on a new carving, a small figure of a mountain goat that he planned to give Rebecca for Christmas. The fire was crackling softly, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. Snow was falling outside, tapping gently against the windows like nature's own lullaby. "Rebecca," Jack said, setting down his carving tools, "would you like to see some old photographs? I was thinking about the past tonight, remembering better times." Rebecca looked up from her knitting, a scarf she was making in soft blue wool. "I'd like that very much." Jack went to the wooden chest where he kept his most precious belongings. Among them was a small collection of photographs, memories from the life he had lived before retreating to this mountain. He rarely looked at them anymore. They brought too much pain. But tonight felt different. Tonight, sharing them with Rebecca, felt like the right thing to do. He pulled out a handful of photos and returned to his chair by the fire. "These are mostly from before I came up here," he said, handing Rebecca the first few pictures. "Family, friends, better days." Rebecca took the photographs carefully, studying each one with genuine interest. There were pictures of Jack as a younger man, clearly happier and more carefree. Photos of him working on construction sites, laughing with friends, posing next to buildings he had helped construct. "You look so different," Rebecca observed quietly. "Younger, of course, but also lighter somehow." Jack nodded. "That was a long time ago. Different life entirely." He handed her another photograph, this one showing him standing next to a younger man who bore a strong family resemblance. Both men were grinning at the camera, their arms thrown around each other's shoulders. They were dressed in work clothes and covered in dust, but their happiness was obvious even in the faded old picture. "That's my brother Danny," Jack said, his voice growing softer. "This was taken at a job site about 10 years ago. We were working construction together then before he got the job at the mine." Rebecca took the photograph and held it closer to the firelight for a better look. Jack watched her face as she studied the image, expecting her to make some polite comment about family resemblance or ask a casual question about his brother. Instead, he saw her expression change dramatically. The color drained from her face, so quickly that Jack thought she might be having some kind of medical emergency. Her hands began to tremble, and the photograph shook in her grip. She stared at the picture as if she had seen a ghost, her breathing becoming short and rapid. "Rebecca?" Jack asked, alarmed. "Are you all right? You look like you've seen—" "What was your brother's full name?" Rebecca whispered, her voice barely audible. "Daniel Wilson," Jack replied, confused by her reaction. "But everyone called him Danny. Why? What's wrong?" Rebecca continued staring at the photograph, tears beginning to form in her eyes. Her whole body had gone rigid, as if she were fighting some internal battle. "Where did he work?" she asked, her voice still barely a whisper. "The copper mine outside Cedar Falls," Jack said, growing more concerned by the second. "Rebecca, what's going on? You're scaring me." She looked up at him then, and Jack saw something in her eyes that made his blood run cold. It was recognition, but more than that. It was grief and guilt and a terrible, crushing sadness that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. "Jack," she said, setting the photograph down with trembling hands. "My name My real name isn't Rebecca Morrison. Jack felt the world shift beneath him, as if the solid foundation of his mountain cabin had suddenly become quicksand. What do you mean? Morrison was my married name, but not from my first husband. Rebecca's voice was growing stronger now, as if saying the words out loud was giving her courage. My first husband's name was Daniel Wilson. Danny Wilson. The words hit Jack like a physical blow. He felt as if all the air had been sucked out of the room, as if the fire had suddenly gone cold, as if the very walls of his cabin were closing in around him. He stared at Rebecca, at this woman he had been living with for months, sharing meals with, growing comfortable with, and realized he didn't know her at all. That's impossible, he said, his voice hoarse. Danny's wife was named, her name was Catherine, Rebecca finished quietly. Catherine Ann Morrison, but I went by my middle name when I married Danny, Ann Wilson. I've been using Rebecca since after he died. Jack's mind reeled as pieces of a puzzle he hadn't even known existed began falling into place. The familiar way Rebecca moved around his kitchen, her knowledge of carpentry and construction work, the sadness in her eyes when she looked at his wood carvings, the way she sometimes paused when organizing his belongings as if something about them triggered memories. "You're Danny's wife," Jack said, the words feeling strange and impossible in his mouth. "You're my sister-in-law." "Yes," Rebecca, Ann, whispered. "I've known who you were since the moment we met at the diner. I recognized you immediately from the stories Danny used to tell, from the few photographs he had of his family." Jack felt a surge of anger mixed with confusion and hurt. "You've known this whole time? You've been lying to me for months?" "I wasn't lying about needing work or wanting to help," Ann said quickly. "Everything I told you about my situation was true. I did lose my husband, Michael Morrison. I was struggling financially. I did need this job desperately. But you didn't tell me who you really were." Jack stood up abruptly, pacing to the window and staring out at the snow-covered darkness. "Why? Why would you keep this from me?" Ann was quiet for a long moment, gathering her thoughts. When she spoke again, her voice was heavy with 8 years of carried guilt and sorrow. "Because I was ashamed," she said simply. "Because I blamed myself for what happened to Danny, and I thought you probably blamed me too." Jack turned around to face her, his anger temporarily replaced by confusion. "Blamed you for what? Danny died in a mine accident. How could that possibly be your fault?" Tears were flowing freely down Ann's face now. "The morning of the accident, Danny and I had a terrible fight. About money, about his job at the mine, about everything. I told him I was tired of worrying about him every day, tired of him risking his life for such small pay. I said maybe he should find different work, safer work." She paused, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "Danny got angry and said I didn't understand anything about providing for a family. He said if I didn't like how he made money, maybe I should find a way to make some myself. He stormed out of the house without saying goodbye, without our usual morning kiss. Those were the last words we ever spoke to each other." Jack felt his anger deflating as he began to understand the burden Ann had been carrying. "Ann, that fight didn't cause the accident. You know that, right?" "Do I?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Because all I could think about afterward was that if I hadn't pushed him, if I hadn't made him angry, maybe he would have been more careful that day. Maybe he would have noticed something was wrong with the mine shaft. Maybe he would have come home safely." "That's not how it works," Jack said softly, moving back toward his chair. "Accidents happen. The mine had safety problems that had nothing to do with you or your fight." "I know that logically," Ann replied. "But guilt doesn't always listen to logic. After Danny died, I felt like I had failed him as a wife. When you moved up to this mountain and cut yourself off from everyone, I felt like I had lost my connection to his family too. I wanted to reach out to you, but I was too ashamed." Jack sat back down, his head spinning with this new information. The woman he had been sharing his home with for months was the same woman his brother had loved and married. She had been grieving Danny just as much as he had, carrying her own burden of guilt and regret. "When I saw your job posting, Anne continued. I thought maybe it was fate giving me a chance to make things right. I could help you the way I should have helped Danny. But I was terrified that if you knew who I was, you would reject me. You might blame me for the fight, or for not being able to save him, or for remarrying afterward. You remarried, Jack said, remembering what she had told him about Michael Morrison. The days following Anne's revelation were some of the most difficult either of them had experienced since Danny's death. The comfortable routine they had built together was shattered, replaced by an awkwardness that seemed to fill every corner of the cabin. They moved around each other like strangers, speaking only when necessary, each lost in their own thoughts about what this discovery meant. Jack found himself studying Anne's face at meals, looking for traces of his brother in her expressions, trying to imagine her as the young woman Danny had fallen in love with all those years ago. It was strange to think that this person he had grown so comfortable with had once been part of his family, had shared holidays and birthdays and ordinary moments with the brother he still missed every day. Anne, meanwhile, seemed to be wrestling with her own set of emotions. She had carried the secret of Jack's identity for months, and now that it was out in the open, she appeared both relieved and terrified. She continued to cook and clean with her usual efficiency, but Jack could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she jumped slightly whenever he entered a room unexpectedly. On the third day after the revelation, Jack couldn't stand the uncomfortable silence any longer. He found Anne in the kitchen, kneading bread dough with more force than the task required, and decided it was time to address the elephant in the room. We need to talk, he said, settling into a chair at the small kitchen table, Anne's hands stilled on the dough. I know, she said quietly, not turning around to face him. I've been thinking about whether I should leave when the weather breaks. Is that what you want? Jack asked, surprised by how much the thought of her leaving bothered him. No, Anne replied honestly, finally turning to face him. But I understand if you want me to go. This situation has become complicated. Jack looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not just his brother's widow but the woman who had brought his cabin back to life, who had helped him remember how to be human again. Whatever complicated feelings her true identity had stirred up, the simple fact remained that she had made his life immeasurably better. I don't want you to leave, he said carefully, but I think we need to figure out how to move forward. This changes things between us, but it doesn't have to ruin them. Anne sat down across from him, her hands still dusted with flour. I should have told you from the beginning, I know that now, but I was so afraid. I understand why you didn't, Jack interrupted, and I'm not angry about it anymore. I was shocked, and maybe a little hurt that you felt you couldn't trust me with the truth. But I'm not angry. Danny talked about you all the time, Anne said softly. He loved you so much, looked up to you. He always said his big brother could fix anything, build anything, solve any problem. After the accident, when you disappeared up here, I wondered if you blamed yourself the way I blame myself. Jack felt a familiar tightness in his chest. I was supposed to be working at the mine that day, too. I had a job in town that ran late, so I told Danny to go ahead without me. If I had been there, you might have died too, Anne finished firmly. That's what Danny would have said. He wouldn't have wanted you to carry guilt about surviving. Just like he wouldn't have wanted you to carry guilt about that fight, Jack replied. Seems we've both been punishing ourselves for things that weren't our fault. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of 8 years of misplaced guilt settling between them. Then Anne spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. I miss him so much. Even after all this time, sometimes I wake up and for just a moment I forget he's gone. Then reality crashes back and it hurts all over again. Jack nodded, understanding completely. I used to talk to him sometimes up here alone. Told him about my day, asked his advice about things. Probably made me sound crazy, but it helped. You weren't crazy, Anne said with a sad smile. I still talk to him too. Usually when I'm cooking. He always loved to watch me cook, said it was like watching magic happen. He was right, Jack said. The way you cook is magical. Danny always was smart about things like that. As they talked about Danny, Sharing memories and stories, Jack began to see a different side of Anne. This wasn't just the efficient housekeeper who had transformed his cabin, or even the mysterious woman whose true identity had shocked him. This was someone who had loved his brother deeply, who understood the kind of man Danny had been, who could help keep his memory alive in ways Jack had never imagined possible. "Tell me about your wedding," Jack said impulsively. Danny never gave me details, just said it was perfect. Anne's face lit up with the first genuine smile Jack had seen from her since the revelation. It was small, just family and a few close friends. Danny wore his father's suit, which was too big for him, but he refused to have it altered because he said it made him feel connected to family history. She continued, describing the simple ceremony, the reception in the church basement, the way Danny had cried when she walked down the aisle. Jack found himself laughing at some of the stories, able to picture his brother perfectly in each scene Anne described. He was so nervous about the vows, Anne continued. He practiced them for weeks, but when the moment came, he forgot everything he had planned to say. Instead, he just told me he loved me and promised to make me laugh every day for the rest of our lives. Did he keep that promise? Jack asked. Every single day, Anne replied, tears in her eyes but still smiling. Even on the bad days, even when we were fighting about money or work or anything else, he always found a way to make me laugh before we went to sleep. As the days passed, Jack and Anne continued to share memories of Danny, and slowly their relationship began to heal and reshape itself. They were no longer just employer and employee or even friends. They were family, connected by love for the same man, bound together by shared grief and slowly emerging from that grief together. Jack began to share stories about Danny's childhood, about the adventures they had as boys exploring these very mountains. He told Anne about the time Danny had insisted they build a raft to sail across the mountain lake, and how it had sunk within 5 minutes of launching. He described Danny's first attempt at carving wood, and how he had accidentally carved halfway through the kitchen table before their mother caught him. Anne reciprocated with stories from their married life, painting a picture of Danny as a husband that filled gaps in Jack's understanding of who his brother had become as an adult. She told him about Danny's dreams of starting his own construction business, about his plan to build them a house with his own hands, about the way he sang off-key in the shower every morning and left little love notes in her lunch pail. He wanted children, Anne said one evening as they sat by the fire. We were trying, but it just never happened. Danny said maybe it wasn't meant to be, that maybe we were supposed to focus on taking care of each other instead. He would have been a good father, Jack said. He practically raised me after our parents died. I was only 16 and Danny was just 22, but he made sure I finished school, learned a trade, became a decent man. He talked about that. Anne nodded. He was so proud of you, so grateful that you turned out well despite everything. He used to say you were proof that he hadn't completely messed up his responsibilities as the older brother. Older brother? Jack looked at her in confusion. Danny was my younger brother. Anne stared at him for a moment, then began to laugh. Not with humor, but with the kind of laughter that comes when you realize you've discovered something both touching and ridiculous. Jack, she said when she could speak again. Danny told me he was the older brother. He said he felt responsible for you because you were the baby of the family. Jack felt his own laughter bubbling up. That impossible kid. He was trying to impress you by making himself sound more mature and responsible. So you were actually the one taking care of him? Absolutely. Danny was brilliant and funny and had the biggest heart in the world, but he couldn't be trusted to remember to eat lunch if someone didn't remind him. I used to pack his lunch every day and leave notes telling him not to forget it. They laughed together at this small deception, this tiny white lie that Danny had told to make himself seem more impressive to the woman he was courting. It was such a Danny thing to do, sweet and silly and ultimately harmless. As winter gradually gave way to spring, Jack and Anne found their rhythm again, but it was different now, better. They were no longer two damaged people using each other's company to avoid dealing with their pain. They were family members who had found each other again, who could help each other heal while keeping Danny's memory alive. Jack began teaching Anne some of the skills Danny had never had time to learn, how to properly maintain tools, how to read the weather signs that warned of sudden mountain storms, how to track animals through the forest. Anne taught Jack things that Danny had learned from her: how to appreciate small pleasures like a perfectly timed meal, how to make a house feel like a home, how to find joy in simple daily routines. When the snow finally melted enough for the road to be passable again, neither of them mentioned the possibility of Anne leaving. The cabin had become their shared home, their refuge, their place of healing. They had created something together that neither wanted to give up.